I'll ask Daniel Cohen to introduce our speaker.
Well, thank you very much. I just want to thank everyone for coming out today, because we do try at McLaughlin College to give some space for new voices in public debates and public discussions, and for some new ideas, and also sort of some reinterpretations of some old ones. And all of those things very well fit our speaker today, Mr. Saeed Selvam, from the Laidlaw Foundation, where he is the Director of Public Policy. Saeed's a recent graduate of the University of Toronto's Master's Program in Public Policy and Governance, and has been active for a good deal of his adult life in the political and community life of the Greater Toronto Area and Ontario. Today he's going to be talking on a topic that's particularly fitting for the room we're in, which is the need for a disruption in philanthropy. And I say that because we are, as all of you know, in McLaughlin College, which is of course named for the McLaughlin family, and most notably the gentleman who's over there, Colonel Sam McLaughlin. And in many ways, this university would not have been created without the generous support, both at its initial stage when the campus land was acquired and buildings such as this were created, and then ongoing for now the last 60 years of the McLaughlin family. So they are very much, the McLaughlin name, very much synonymous with the concept of philanthropy in Canada, and especially here in the Toronto area. I can't really imagine what York would look like without their many generous gifts. And with that little bit of an intro, I'd like to welcome Saeed to the lectern and turn it over again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you everybody for having me. This is an honor. It's always an honor to have the opportunity to stand in front of people and speak, especially at York University. I've heard a lot of great things about this program and this college, so I'm extremely grateful to actually have the opportunity to share some of the things that I'm working on, both in the public policy side, the philanthropy side, and also when it comes to advocacy. Now, my background is on the poster, so you'll see a little bit about my journey in terms of how I got to the position I'm at right now at the Laidlaw Foundation. But I've been struggling with a bit of a challenge that I'd like us to really think about today. And it's a question, so I want to pose it to you. Because we have a nice, intimate group, I'd love the opportunity to make this highly interactive. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities for back and forth and discussion. But the question that I have is, should philanthropic foundations, who are mandated oftentimes to give away 2 to 3.5% of their budget to charities and nonprofits, should they continue to do so for the greater good, or should they be paying their fair share in taxes? So I'm going to circle back. So I'd like you all to think about that, and we're going to come back to that question. But in order to fully answer that, it's always good to have a solid understanding of the sector. So we call this the third sector. How many of you are familiar with the third sector? If I could just see a show of hands. Okay, so the third sector is oftentimes known as charities, nonprofits, social service organizations. In many cases, that can include universities. It includes hospitals as well. But oftentimes it doesn't talk too much about philanthropic foundations. Does anybody know the difference between a philanthropic foundation and a nonprofit? Any thoughts? Yes?
Well, a non-profit is supposed to be a foundation or a group, whatever, that does what they can to help people who are in need of help, and they don't charge anything for it, whereas so many of our doctors and nurses and everything, well, they do what they do, but that's how they make their living. That's how they put meat and potatoes. That's how they get their Yorkshire pudding put on their plate, is by the work that they do in the hospital. Whereas some of these other people, they're doing it, and it's a good thing they're doing it, but they're doing it mainly out of the goodness of their heart.
Right, and that is a great point. So oftentimes nonprofits, they are social service organizations, and in some cases they don't have what we call charitable status. Charitable status allows an organization to cut a tax receipt to their donors, oftentimes providing an incentive for donors to give money to that organization. In many cases in the nonprofit sector, the jobs are precarious. So in organizations that many of you will be familiar with, like Free the Children or the United Way, those are some of the larger nonprofit organizations, to smaller grassroots organizations like the Amadeus Project and the Remix Project, some of these organizations you may not have heard of. But oftentimes in the sector, especially in Canada, it becomes a very small, very intimate sector. And because of the precariousness of the jobs and the precariousness of the funding, there needs to be some ability to actually fundraise outside of just asking individuals for donations. Imagine Canada, which is an organization that scans nonprofits and the health of nonprofits across the country, came out with a report called 30 Years of Giving in Canada. It was commissioned by the Rideau Hall Foundation. And what they found is that charitable giving by individuals has been on the decline for the past 30 years. Yet the amounts that individuals are giving to nonprofits, the individuals that continue to give to nonprofits, is actually increasing. Does anybody have any ideas as to why people and individuals might not be giving as much as they used to? Any thoughts as to why they might not be giving money to nonprofits as much as they used to? And this is also a generational thing as well. There's no right or wrong answer. Yes, in the back.
Well, I think a generation ago, one of the major recipients of giving were churches and synagogues. And the religious sector probably gets much less in donations because people are less religious than they used to be.
It's a great point, but believe it or not, it's actually the religious giving, along with international giving, that's on the increase. But one of the biggest issues that people have actually cited for why they don't give to nonprofits anymore is because they are less trusting of where those dollars are going. So when you start to see organizations and charities run public campaigns and public ads, in many cases, the public is wanting their dollars, especially when they give more and more nowadays, to go directly to service provisions. They don't like the idea of dollars funding overhead of nonprofits. That means funding salaries, making sure that lights are kept on. And this is one of the pet peeves that I've had as somebody who's been in this sector for quite some time, because I started out as a grassroots activist with little to no resources. I started my sort of career and entry point into this sector after the Summer of the Gun. And I was doing a lot of grassroots community advocacy. And when you're doing community advocacy as a volunteer, your resources and your time and also your patience become very, very strapped. Because at the end of the day, you're doing something good, but for free. And those social service organizations that have low budgets, they're finding it more and more difficult to actually acquire funding from the public because of this new sort of paradox where the public is saying, we want our dollars to go directly to service provisions, but now foundations, actual private family foundations that give to nonprofits, must pick up the slack and fund the overhead. So this is an interesting thing to consider as we sort of go on throughout the conversation. Yes?
Is there any sense that people distinguish between two types of overhead? One is, yes, paying the bills for the heat and the lighting and staff. The other is the cost of the fundraising campaign itself.
Right.
And I have heard people who recognize infrastructure costs are necessary, but don't want to pay, to be asked for the money in the first place.
That's right, yeah. For the most part, because the general public doesn't necessarily have the want or the need to spend the time understanding the differences between the two, and also the importance between the two, oftentimes they don't have that ability to actually see the difference. So they just feel that if their money is going towards an organization, it doesn't matter what it's going to unless it goes directly to the service provision. They want to see the dollars spent directly on the individuals that need the most amount of help. So that's the nonprofit sector. And oftentimes, again, it falls under the third sector. What a lot of people are, I feel, more unfamiliar with are philanthropic foundations. Now, philanthropic foundations include the foundation that I work for. Oftentimes, they're foundations that were founded by families, especially wealthy families, who basically put forward an investment. Oftentimes, those families are doing well. They put forward an investment to create a family foundation. That investment is then carefully invested into the market. And over years, that asset base that they invested grows. So the Laidlaw Foundation in the 1930s was founded by Robert Laidlaw. And Robert Laidlaw was an individual who made his fortune through lumber. And he owned the lumber business. And actually, if many of you remember, many of you are young enough to remember, when a few years ago there were Laidlaw buses. And that was the original sort of transportation company following the lumber company that the Laidlaws owned. And the Laidlaws actually sold that company, but the company kept the name. So they started out with a $4 million investment into the market. Over years, that $4 million investment became $75 million in assets. So because it's a private charitable foundation, that foundation provides the family and provides the actual foundation itself, because it has charitable status, the opportunity to not get taxed, and also they're mandated to only give away between 2 to 3.5% of those assets. So every year, that's about anywhere between $2 to $4 million to give away to charities and nonprofits. So that's sort of the difference between philanthropic foundations and nonprofit organizations. Philanthropic foundations have a lot of money, staff is well paid, jobs are not precarious, benefits are included. Nonprofit organizations are the actual service providers. These are the individuals on the ground every single day serving the public and serving a need, and oftentimes they have trouble keeping their lights on. The executive directors of these organizations find it difficult day in and day out to focus on their mission versus applying for funding, and oftentimes they have to focus more on funding and keeping the lights on, unless they're giants like the United Way. Now, one of the biggest issues that's happening right now in the city of Toronto and also across the country is that while there are close to 170,000 registered charities across the country, the philanthropic sector and the nonprofit sector is very small. It's very closed. A lot of individuals know each other. It becomes the same faces. And oftentimes to get a grant, it's not what you know, it's who you know. So in this sector, this is one of the things that I've seen, and this is why it was important for me to sort of say that I was on the other side. I was so much so on the other side of this that when I started doing my community activism, I was working with city councilors and the mayor, and at that time they had asked me to create a nonprofit organization called the Spark Initiative. Spark Initiative was a national nonprofit and NGO. During that time while I was creating the organization with some of these staff founders, we had to apply for funding. Lo and behold, I had applied to the Laidlaw Foundation 10 years ago for funding. I didn't get the funding. So 10 years later, I came back and I got a job. But that's essentially how small this sector is. I had actually, so as I came back 10 years later, I actually ended up working with some of the individuals who I actually applied to and got rejected from. A little awkward. But nonetheless, it's an important discussion because you have a certain sector that is often not talked about. It's not talked about in many schools as a career path. And it's often not talked about in terms of accountability. Yet it's a certain sector that wields an incredible amount of influence and an incredible amount of power, both politically, socially, and financially as well. Laidlaw Foundation's asset base, once again, is $75 million. one of our sister foundations, the McLaughlin Family Foundation, has one of the largest asset bases, close to $500 million. And this is just a drop in the hat. This is just talking Canada. When we start moving south of the border, we start to see foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Clinton Global Initiative. All these foundations have mass amounts of asset bases. Oftentimes, though, the performance of these assets are not dependent on how people sell or how well the staff within the organization perform. It is dependent on the market. Therefore, philanthropic foundations have a really incredible opportunity to straddle the line between the public sector and the private sector. They straddle the line so well that oftentimes they're not held accountable. They don't need to be held accountable in the same way that government does, or in the same way even a private sector company does. A private sector company, for instance, their main concern is satisfying either their shareholders or their customers. Public sector, especially if you're in government, your main concern is the public, accountability. Philanthropic foundations oftentimes are able to fall under the radar, which is quite interesting. So as we revisit that question, should philanthropic foundations be paying their fair share in taxes, or should they continue to give? I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of government relations positions within foundations. Now, a government relations position, public policy position, which oftentimes aligns with government relations position, are very new to the foundation world in Canada, specifically Ontario as well. So currently, the Maitre Foundation, which is another philanthropic foundation founded by the Broadbents, and the Laidlaw Foundation are two of the only foundations with actual public policy capacity. Why is this important? Why is it important for philanthropic foundations to actually have a public policy capacity? Any thoughts, any original sort of thoughts that come to mind as to why this might be important? Yes?
So the long-term changes you're trying to make won't necessarily be effective often if there's no policy changes.
Absolutely, absolutely, dead on. So one of the issues that nonprofits have, especially when they're applying for funding, is that oftentimes one of their largest funders is government. So when they're applying for funding from government, it becomes very difficult for them to actually advocate or call for change, call for policy change. It becomes difficult to simply bite the hand that feeds you. So philanthropic foundations, and this was a move of our board 2 years ago to basically say we need a public policy capacity within our foundation to, in some cases, speak truth to power, in some cases, shake things up if need be, and in some cases, support our grantees, the people that we give money to, support their agendas and help connect them, sometimes be the voice for them when they can't be a voice for themselves because they're afraid of losing major government grants. So that's essentially the role, that's the position. And it's important to have these positions, especially when you have a foundation, an organization that is barely accountable. If I launch a news conference in 2 weeks, speaking about our dissatisfaction, to say the least, with many of the cuts right now that are happening provincially to the social services sector, if I were to do that, in any other organization, I would have to be very careful with what I say, how I say it, and the people I piss off. Coming from a philanthropic foundation, it is very, in some cases, liberating to have that long of a leash where you can actually say things without worrying about, okay, your major funding source being jeopardized. So, in that case, should philanthropic foundations not be having more, and there are many across the country, especially those with larger budgets, but should they not be having more influence? Right now, some of the most active government relations / lobbying folks within the charitable sector and the nonprofit sector are the United Way. United Way does a lot of great work, especially when it comes to sitting on tables, being a part of reform discussions. But many philanthropic foundations don't take that step. They feel that their number one goal is to grant, and if they're granting, it should be serving the purposes of the family. Not to mention, and again, this was going to be candid, but not to mention, it also provides a fantastic tax write-off. It provides almost a tax shelter. So in some cases, you have to be very careful with how you're actually coming across when you're a philanthropic foundation versus being a nonprofit organization. So that's yes,
When you say tax shelter,
yes,
in the case of the Laidlaw Foundation,
yes.
do the members of the Laidlaw family now still get a tax benefit from that original $3 million donation?
So they don't anymore. And this is unique to the Laidlaw Foundation because Robert Laidlaw, in some of the founding documents for the foundation, wanted to make sure that he didn't have anywhere over 50% of family members sitting on the board. So this could be for many reasons. It could be for the fact that he didn't get along with his family, because it is unique. Oftentimes you have boards of family foundations that are controlled by the family. He wanted to make sure that wasn't the case. So it had to be under 50%. So we currently have only 2 members of the Laidlaw family on the board. So he was very concerned with that. He wanted to make sure that this was within the public interest, that you actually have individuals from the community who come in, they sit on the board, and they guide where we should be giving our money to. So, but it's a great question. A lot of individuals and a lot of foundations actually have a majority, so more than 50% of family members of the founding family sitting on the board.
If there are family members on the board, how does that get them a tax benefit?
Yeah.
So it depends. So in many cases, the family members can also be staff. In some cases as well. A lot of the smaller foundations staff-wise, so for instance, like I'm not saying the McCain Foundation does this, but McCain Foundation, everybody's familiar with McCain's, McCain fries, those frozen juices, yes? So their family foundation, they have a very small board, and Margaret McCain, she's actually essentially the CEO and director of that. So there are ways of, I'm not saying they do this, I don't know about their back end, but there are ways of actually sitting on the staff. If they're board members, they have the ability to also control how donations are given, and in some cases they get discretionary funds. So they can either be paid board members, or they can actually get a discretionary fund where they can give to charities or causes of their choosing. So that's also a different way. When they do that, they can also get a personal tax receipt back. Sorry, did you have a question?
Yeah, no, same state.
So that's what's very interesting about the philanthropic sector right now. And the fact that the government relations rules are new to the sector is also creating a bit of a learning curve for foundations as well. Because public policy professionals oftentimes are trained to research, they're trained to analyze, and in some cases, when they have the experience, they're trained to lobby. This means building the relationships with various levels of government, having the ability to actually put forward policy proposals, and making sure that those policy proposals ideally get passed. When I try and explain my job to people, it's oftentimes confusing because the word public policy oftentimes has different meanings to different peoples. Sometimes public policy can fall under public affairs. Other times it can combine public relations as well. So when people hire for public policy roles, oftentimes there's a huge communications component that's required, and then public affairs components also requires public policy professionals to have a public policy and a lobbying background, a communications background, and oftentimes an event planner in some cases background as well. Events are important, especially if you want to drive a campaign. If you want to be able to influence government, if you want to be able to influence legislation, let's say you're having difficulties trying to get your point across to government, it's important then to understand how to craft a mass sort of policy influence campaign, communications campaign. So there's a lot of different definitions of the public policy sort of position. What that causes though within foundations is where does a public policy manager, where does a public policy director fit inside the hierarchy? Foundations normally, staff-wise, their number one sort of objective is to grant. So they receive applications or they solicit applications, they review the applications, they refer it to a committee of the board, and the board basically decides whether or not that organization is getting a grant. So a public policy role within the foundation role is extremely important because you have the ability to advocate and you operate almost separately from your granting team. You have the ability to actually go out and make relationships. You have the ability to go out and start advocating. And you have the ability to, in some cases, provide a different communications angle to the foundation. You can actually move the needle on some of the most pressing issues of the day, especially those issues that are facing the people that you give money to. Now, one real amazing landmark decision that was recently reached was a decision where the CRA has agreed that nonprofits and charities can now engage in political activity as long as it doesn't support or promote a political party in an unlimited capacity. So as long as it is nonpartisan, prior to this decision, there was a 10% limit on how charities and nonprofits could advocate. So this is pretty groundbreaking because a lot of charities and nonprofits were very afraid of getting anywhere politically involved. They wanted to make sure that the CRA didn't have them under their spotlight in the event that they would get audited and potentially lose that coveted charitable status. So that landmark decision is extremely important because it allows organizations to freely and equally move and act and become active. One of the issues that we got a slap on the wrist for was this last provincial election. We commissioned an organization, a youth-led organization called Apathy is Born. We commissioned them to put together a report card covering the actual policy positions of the 3 political parties that were running and just providing it to young people. We wanted to make sure that we translated complex jargon into something that was easy to understand for young people. So we commissioned them to provide us with a product. We blasted it out on social media once it was created, and it was fantastic in terms of translating some of those complex issues. The challenge was that Elections Ontario reached out a few weeks later, and they said, if you don't take this down, you may be fined because we consider it political advertising. And that's not accurate. That's technically not accurate under their own legislation. So that was something that we would have had to fight if they pursued it. Luckily they didn't. But this landmark decision now really provides us with the ability to do things like that risk-free. But to see a foundation actually get a slap on the wrist like that and say, we're warning you, a fine's coming down the line, is where you can begin to see already the problems. All we were doing was translating the party's position. We were not taking any political positions, we were not supporting any political party, and we were being equal in our coverage. So that was some of the interesting discourse that happened not too long ago. But as I say some of this, I want to be able to revisit our question. I hope that you've been thinking a little bit about it. But our original question, which is, should philanthropic foundations continue to give between 2 to 3.5% of their disbursement quota, so their budget, to charities and nonprofits in order to maximize impact for the common good and public good, or should they pay their fair share in taxes?
What is their fair share of taxes?
So it depends on the actual assets of the foundation, but oftentimes it could be 18% plus, so it would be taxed close to the corporate tax rate.
Would be tax on the earnings on the investment,
That's
not
correct.
on the capital.
That's correct, yes. So that would be a significant amount of money. So even if you consider 2 to 3.5% of a foundation's disbursement quota, depending on like 2 to 3.5% of the McLaughlin Family Foundation, which is $500 million, is a heck of a lot of money. So it's still important. But what that does is it provides the foundation with the ability to be very specific in who they give to. So when they're choosing, it's either they're choosing based on their organizational priorities or their strategic plan, and they're focused on their own sort of benefit. They say, we want to go into this area, we want to spend a lot of time in this area, it's a topic or area that will not change overnight, we want to be invested in it. Or instead of that, should they be paying or in addition to that, should they be paying their fair share of taxes? Because again, that charitable status exempts them quite a bit, yes.
How much money are we talking about in Canada? Say 2 to 3 or 20% of the total earnings of all these trusts. What do you come to?
So that one, I'm not too sure. I know that social service and charitable sector activity in the country contributes to about 8% of the GDP. It's close to 120 million, I believe, or billion. I have to check that. I have to get back to you. But the actual sort of quota and the actual 20%, between 18 to 20% of every philanthropic foundation, that one I'm not too sure. But I know it would be a lot. Yeah.
Just to make sure that we're all thinking of the right numbers.
Yes.
Am I correct that currently a foundation can give 2 to 3% of its total assets or of its annual earnings.
Of its annual earnings.
Okay,
Yes.
so
Its annual earnings.
the Laidlaw Foundation with $75 million in capital
Yes.
earns, let's say 5%. Of that 5%, 2 to 3% is given away, and 97 to 98% adds to the 75 million.
Correct.
If they pay tax on that 5%,
Yes.
then 18% would go in tax, 2 to 3% would go in
Sure, it's not
donations, and they'd still have 79 to 80% to add to the 75 million.
Right.
That's.
Right.
Okay.
And all those assets are invested in the market. So whether it's dividends, whether it's any of those returns, that's what's coming back. So that's why it's such a significant conversation right now, because foundations are basically at a crossroads. In many cases, some of the problems that continue is that the same organizations are getting funding. A lot of the smaller organizations are having to compete in ways that they never had to before, due to things like social media, or due to things like not having a strong enough social enterprise strategy where they only rely on one revenue source. So competition is increasing, and the larger foundations and the larger organizations, especially the nonprofits, that are well known to the sector oftentimes are the first candidates in line to actually receive the larger checks. So that's one challenge that's happening. That's why there's a potential move or potential conversation that we could think about. And from a public policy perspective, it would be really interesting to start discovering or start at least exploring that possibility, where we say, should we be giving more in different ways? And giving more through taxes, of course, benefits the country in different ways. Yes?
So I don't think charitable foundations should be taxed more, but I do think that the investments should be in social purpose projects with some return, like social investment type of return, and that the majority charities should have some kind of sunset clause, like give away 2% of the actual assets, and maybe 50 years you're done, right? Because if you're continuing for 100 years, you haven't moved the needle. Like, what are you doing? Right?
Exactly. Yeah. No, that's a great point. What I find really interesting about the sector is because it's so insular and because it's so small, especially in Canada, the grants that we give are a lot smaller per capita. So it's very important to start considering things like this. The tax structure right now provides an incentive for philanthropic foundations to not spend as much as they would have to. They're being taxed as a corporation because of that charitable status. It provides nonprofit organizations with the ability to have an incentive to actually get and receive donations. But with that increased competition, it becomes very, the sort of questions that are being posed is, should nonprofits be actually innovating more? Should they be finding more sort of social enterprise style of ways of diversifying their revenue sources? Should they be reliant on one major source? If you're reliant on funding from one government and then another government comes in, that funding could be pulled. So these are the things that public policy folks, especially within the sector, now have to begin thinking of. Is the career viable? Is the public policy role within the foundation role viable? I think it's extremely viable because it provides that opportunity, along with funding, along with a steady sort of career path that allows sort of lobbyists and public policy professionals to engage in discourse, to actually have the ability to try and move the dial, try and move the needle. So philanthropy as a whole, because of sort of the changing demographics, because we see that the way that young people are giving now as well has changed. Young people, and it's due to young people for the most part, are giving more internationally. Just 4 years ago, this wasn't true. It'd be giving to organizations like UNICEF that have an international scope, where it's so difficult to actually get funding for your organization if you focus on international development. Now we're starting to see a bit of an upgrade, but we're talking about a 2% increase in donations that are going to organizations that are international in scope. So in sort of closing this out, it's a question that I don't know if you have an answer for yet, because I think we still need more information. We do need to know how much money this would be, what difference it would make to the sector. And also sort of analyze impact. And when we talk about impact, it's, are the organizations that we're giving money to the same faces? Are they responsible for much of the change that we wish to see as a society and we wish to see as philanthropic foundations? Is there an issue within leadership right now of philanthropic foundations? Oftentimes philanthropic foundations are not diverse when it comes to leadership. Is this important? Is this an important conversation? Last year at the Philanthropic Foundations of Canada conference, it's a gathering where foundations from all across Canada join and they start to talk about some of the issues, challenges, and best practices within the sector. One of the biggest issues is the diversification of leadership when it comes to foundations, when it comes to charitable foundations specifically. You're seeing a lot of the same demographic that's leading these foundations. And they start to talk about the problems and they start to talk about the need to change that. But true change happens when you actually couple talk with an implementation plan. How do you actually change something like that? Do you employ your HR team, if you do have an HR team, to start accepting resumes and making sure that they're blind resumes, something that the Ontario Public Service is piloting right now, where you actually take in resumes, you remove the name, and you add a number in order to sort of remove unconscious bias from the hiring process whenever you see an ethnic name? Is it about making sure there are more professional development opportunities? There are tons of different issues right now within the philanthropic sector that disruption, innovation, and the ability to move and adapt quickly is so important. Oftentimes, because of the assets and because of the actual money that we're dealing with, it's interesting that in any other sector, organizations like this would have a lot more attention. Some of the problems would be brought to light in a lot more of an effective way. But it's very interesting that the Philanthropic Foundation world, both career-wise and financially, kind of flies under the radar. Yes?
How do you overcome that? And to make a statement, charities in Canada or foundations tend to be balkanized in large part, I'm going to say, based on ethnic or background. Being Jewish, Jews are very good at raising money. And, you know, we sent to Israel, old age, you know, very good at it. I wonder if other minority communities are equally as active and as established as that community. And I've sat on a board that sends money overseas. And I thought of, and to your notion of bringing in that diversity, someone from another ethnic community may not see their values or their interests in alignment that are more aligned, not from a career standpoint, but more from an ethnic background standpoint. How do you tackle that hurdle in the diversity question of bringing in additional talent?
And that's a massive problem. And I think that, especially at the leadership levels, leadership of organizations have to understand the barriers that minoritized and vulnerable communities face. Quick answer to your question is no. Are sort of other organizations or other visible minority groups able to effectively sort of fundraise in the same way that other communities are? No, because one, they have that sort of pre-colonization oppression that has sort of led to generations of just not having the money in the communities. Two, they didn't come from immigrant communities, so oftentimes starting off much further back and oftentimes with less. And three, it's really important to understand that when some of these communities are trying to make it within a sector that is not predominantly talking to them, it becomes very difficult. Oftentimes, and I can speak from my own experience just being a young sort of male of color, either I'm the darkest in a room, especially in a lot of the rooms that I go to, or the youngest in the room. And both of these things can be seen as barriers, oftentimes. And being in some of these rooms where it's not sort of pointed out or highlighted, I'm not asking for a special accommodation. All I'm asking for oftentimes is for my experience to be respected in the same way and to have an equal voice, an equitable voice at the table. That wouldn't have been possible though if I wasn't able to be in this position. And that's why I continue to sort of circle back to my history as a community organizer, because I remember being a community organizer, oftentimes knocking on doors of foundations or going to visit government, and you can tell, this is not something that I can put a number to or a stat to, but you can tell just the energy and the vibe. It's you're a person going into a room and you're being treated like you have your hat in your hand, and it's very dismissive. Versus now, just having the Laidlaw Foundation as sort of part of the background, people understand that when I'm having a conversation with them, it's not to ask them for something, and it completely changes the dynamic. And in many cases, when you're from a vulnerable or minoritized or oppressed community, you have to come to the table with an ask or a request. And just that alone is very demoralizing, it's very demotivating, but factually it's also just very difficult to get when you continue to ask. It's also very difficult to become self-sufficient in that way. So it's a very interesting perspective, and it's a very interesting problem that we have. But in this, the really interesting thing, I had the opportunity to go to the Policy Link conference in Chicago, which is a massive gathering of policy professionals and nonprofits and charities across the United States. And the discourse in Chicago, the discourse in the US was just so completely different. I feel that here, because we're Canadian, we like to be very polite, and we like to sometimes be very diplomatic in our discourse. In the States, it's very interesting, they're very blunt, and they call things for what they are. But I feel because of that, they're able to get things done a little bit quicker because there's nothing lost in fluffy communication.
Right.
And they basically call it, they say, we don't have enough black people on this board. We need to actually hire more of this race in this area. So while the States, of course, has the racial issues, it's because of, in many cases, those racial issues and the struggle there that has sort of provided more of an incentive to have those open and frank conversations. Whereas here, I mean, even when we're talking about race, it's still like, in some cases, it's a debate. You actually have people here who are still surprised that people of certain backgrounds get Harvard, or certain, individuals or minorities are not in positions of leadership. And the thought is that, okay, well, they're not qualified enough. In many cases, when you look at the stats and the data, it doesn't back that.
Do you find in ethnic communities they don't know the expertise in running the foundation? I mean, this is going to sound, I'll be very blunt.
Oh, please.
My tribe is very good at understanding the tax benefits and setting up foundations and what it's for, right? Where in other ethnic communities, do they have that estate planning? Do they have, all of the trusts that are, and the advantages that are there, and someone to teach them what those advantages are beyond the philanthropic cause they're working for. So there's the cause, which is the motivation, but then there's the backroom expertise.
Right.
And again, to be very blunt, my people are very, very good at that.
Yeah, and that's so important, because that is something that doesn't exist. It just doesn't, that foundational knowledge, it's essentially the practices and the best practices of money.
Mm-hmm.
Because everybody understands, if money is power and knowledge is power, how to use that. You still have, ethnic communities who are just trying to get by. If you're too busy trying to figure out survival for tomorrow, it's very difficult to figure out survival for the next year. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges. So a lot of these communities don't have that estate planning. They don't understand sort of these different tax loopholes. And oftentimes, it's those individuals who just with a little bit of knowledge would actually be able to not just help the community, but help themselves. And oftentimes it doesn't exist. So even if it's something as a foundation that we can look into in terms of providing financial education to certain communities that absolutely need it, that would be amazing. But those are some of the conversations that I feel are taken for granted that many other, certain ethnicities feel that other organizations or other ethnicities have access to. And oftentimes that could be the difference that doesn't exist.
I'm going to change the subject and suggest a change to your question to us. You posed the alternative.
Yes.
Of keep giving away to 3%.
Yes.
Or pay fair share of taxes. Without getting into debates about the efficiency of government bureaucracy as compared to other bureaucracies. What about a third alternative,
Okay,
which is not to pay taxes, but to mandate a higher distribution of earnings? And let me just give a couple of examples. York University, if a donor wants to give a donation for some purpose, to establish a scholarship, to do whatever, and the university accepts the money, it's the university's policy rather than CRA regulation, that a portion of that endowment will be spent each year, and the remainder will be used for inflation protection to preserve the purchasing power of the endowment. So it's way more than 2% to 3% of the earning.
right.
It has gone down because inflation and the market have changed, but I can remember 15 to 20 years ago, it was 4.5% of capital that was spent each
Right.
year,
Yeah.
and the remainder went into inflation protection.
Yes.
So that an original $100,000 donation might become $150,000 because you could buy as much with 4.5% of 100,000 then as you can with 4.5% of 150,000 now.
Exactly.
As you've described it, charitable foundations are set up to grow much faster than inflation. So what if they still grew faster than inflation, but not so fast? And instead of giving 2 to 3%, they gave 18%
Yes.
annual. They'd still be having 82%
That's right.
to add to capital. What about that as a public policy alternative?
Yeah, and I think that's phenomenal. I think that's actually a happy medium between the two. Because one of the biggest issues that the philanthropic sector would have right now with, of course, paying more taxes is just the will to be able to do it. So in order to actually mount any sort of campaign that requires government to actually make that decision, government would then know that they'd be irritating a lot of the philanthropic foundations, who in some cases have family members who are political party donors. Right? So that's one of the issues. So in this case, it might be a happy medium, but it still is more money. So should it happen? Absolutely. How can it happen, and how can we actually generate the support for it in the sector? I definitely think that there would be more support for that than taxing the fair share rate. But that's definitely an interesting, potentially problem-solving solution.
And your foundation could be doing 6 times as much.
Yeah, absolutely.
But still
Absolutely.
growing.
Absolutely.
So what would the government's comeback be to Professor Leighton Brown's proposal, even though it's halfway? Is it that many people on the foundations kind of wear 2 hats, in as much as very much a political class as it is a philanthropic class? Or is there a real policy that they come back with and say, no, this compromise is not acceptable because of, and I don't know what the answer is. What do you hear?
It's definitely a possibility, because you do have a lot of, again, like either the board members of a foundation, or in some cases the staff of a foundation, who are also political contributors themselves. So it really depends on the foundation. For instance, Laidlaw wouldn't have that issue just because of the makeup of the board, and also because of the makeup of the staff. But many of the foundations that we know would actually have that sort of, almost like a conflict, and I could see it not going down too well. But
What's the pushback to that? Because that sounds like a very reasonable idea. If you were to play the devil's advocate, why would you say no to that proposal, Professor Leighton Brown, if you were the government?
I think the government would be more than happy to do it. I just think that they don't want to be pissing off people when they don't have to, especially when they're some of their largest owners. That would be the only thing, I think. Obviously, I think a lot of members and elected officials, especially within the Conservative Party as well, because right now that's what we're seeing in Ontario specifically with the Conservatives, is that because they're pulling funding, they're actually in some cases meeting with philanthropic foundations that did this with us, and they're literally saying, you guys pick up the slack where we pull.
Yeah.
So I think, depending on the government, you'll have government that'll be more in favor of it, and others that may be less, but I think that'll be the common thing, for sure.
Yes, sir, if I may please
Yes,
say something. I just want to say something, especially to the gentleman with the deep voice over there where I'm pointing. I'm not sure of your name, but there's a fellow there with a deep voice who said that it seemed to him that, I mean, this is what it seems like to me. He said that his race, or his tribe was more seemingly talented with things like figures than maybe other different races are, and I'm looking at things on a religious aspect, and some people may say lay off the religion, but if I may see my piece, certainly I do believe that God made everybody different and yet wonderful, and this gentleman here on the left side may very well be very, very talented with figures, and if that is the way they were schooled practically from the crib right up till now, then that's what you can expect. Whereas, as for some others, like some of the Afro-Americans, they seem to be a lot more talented in things like athletics and everything. And if this is not the case, and you don't want to believe that sort of thing, I'm not going to twist people's fingers, but I'm just going to say to you that if you don't want to believe that, well then make yourself into that identity and that person that you want to be, if that's what you feel you can do.
My point, Randall, was not so much an innate talent as it was maybe out of necessity. Some communities learn to organize and put charities together, and
Historical knowledge. It's just passed down often. It's just passed down. In other communities, they oftentimes don't have that luxury or ability. So it's not necessarily out of choice, but it's just out of history.
Out of necessity, or just out of the
So I was
way.
curious, in the Canadian makeup, what other ethnicities in Canada are very good at fundraising and providing philanthropic initiatives within their own community?
So so you have a lot of organization, like nonprofits. And this is why again, that's what the difference between the nonprofits and the foundation, because you have a ton of nonprofits that sprout up to address issues, to address social issues. So in many cases, you have a lot of nonprofits that have sprouted up to address a lot of the indigenous community issues, or a lot of the Black Canadian issues that are being dealt with in the justice sector and the education sector. But they're nonprofit organizations. They realize that in order to actually start a foundation, though, which gives you sort of that intergenerational wealth and that sustainability, you actually have to have the money. Because these communities don't necessarily start off with the money, they start off on the side of where they're asking for the funds, as opposed to on the side where they can, have the ability to pool funds together and create a foundation. Something that other communities can do a lot more effectively. So that's kind of where things are at right now, unfortunately. But I do see that things are getting better. One thing that we have to start thinking about differently, though, is just the way the public is starting to see nonprofits and foundations. I think that foundations and nonprofits contribute incredible amounts of effort and impact to not just the Canadian economy, but to well-being across the country. And as we're starting to see right now, it's almost like an X graph right now, where you're starting to see just the donations go down in terms of the amount of people. Of course, the people who are donating more. But the individuals that are donating less, the number one reason that they cited in the surveys is that they just don't trust the organizations. They don't trust that their dollars are going directly to an organization. And despite the fact that we may feel that religious funding is actually going down, it's actually going up, which is interesting, at least in Canada. Religious followed by international, but the area that is sort of given the most is health, right? So hospitals, especially, and then education. So a very, very interesting time right now in the country, very interesting.
Where would academia fall in that in terms of foundation giving? I mean, religion, health, academia, does it fall somewhere?
Education is the second highest recipient of funds in terms of the amount, not by the amount of people, but the actual dollar amount. And that's because one of their main donors is government. Yeah. So they give the largest amounts.
You mentioned attending, I forget the name, the
Also,
charitable foundation's
in Chicago.
annual conference.
Well,
one
philanthropic
year-
foundations here, yeah.
Right. Is the issue that you've raised with us here today under discussion by anyone other than yourself? What is your sense of the climate among your peers?
Yeah.
Even for talking about it, let alone for the possible solutions?
So the conversation that we had here today often happens at the conferences. So the annual conference where all the foundations get together, the problem is the action. It's very easy for organizations and foundation leaders to get together in a room and sort of be like, yes, we need more diversity, or yes, we need to be taxed more, or yes, we should be advocating for greater disbursement quota. The issue is the actual implementation, just like everything else. When you go back to work and it's just a little bit out of your day-to-day to actually do this, and you're not being sort of pressured by your board or by your executive director, it sort of falls by the wayside, and you go back to doing business as usual. What I'm trying to say from this perspective is that if we don't start thinking in that way, we start to reinforce the status quo. We start to reinforce a lot of the oppressive structures that sort of existed many years ago, and then we also start to lose interest in the sector. I think that's a big problem. Another part of the Magic Canada sort of report was that you're actually having less and less young people, specifically Generation Y, that are interested in careers in the nonprofit and philanthropic sector. Oftentimes because they conflate the two, and they basically feel that any job in the nonprofit sector is precarious, which is true. Doesn't lead them to as much of an upward mobility as a private sector position, and it's exploitative. I mean that the wages are low, which is true, and they have to put in more hours than sort of a typical 9 to 5. So Gen Y is really starting to show a disturbing trend, but something that we as foundations actually need to start addressing, and we in the public sector need to start addressing in a larger way. We need to start making it more appealing. We need to start focusing more on talent retention strategies. And I think that because we're so caught in the past in terms of the way that our HRs and the way that we structure our benefits packages, even in the nonprofit sector, and the way that we look at it as a society. You know, I realized I saw when the compensation report came out in the Star and Globe Mail in terms of some public sector employees and even the Sunshine List. Oftentimes it causes controversy, a lot of controversy. You know, why should the executive director or the president of UNICEF Canada be getting paid $300,000, $400,000? We don't ask that question. The CEO of Nike or Adidas, or in some cases a hospital, even though hospital is public sector. We don't ask those questions as much, and that's one of the biggest problems, is the way that we look at where our value and dollars are being spent. We don't ask what the president of UNICEF has to do in terms of his day-to-day in comparison to, we don't have this conversation because it just seems bad. If you're a nonprofit, you should not be making money. That's the general.
Or you should be working for less, and I think that
for less, absolutely.
with that misnomer is very bad because, if you look at Gerald Butts, whose name has recently been in the news, he was the CEO of World Wildlife Foundation after he left the Premier's office here in Ontario, and he was making over $250,000. And his job was no different than if it was a private sector job.
That's right.
So there's this idea, well, if you decide to work in the charitable or nonprofit sector, then your salary should be somehow nonprofit or charitable in itself, and it shouldn't be. How do you, then that's more of a generational mindset. I think that would be a great way to shift people to bring that talent in.
Yes.
And that's what the universities should be doing. I don't know if the colleges give any courses or diplomas in foundational diploma, right, because it is a specific talent set. You need to know specific legislation,
Yes.
Regulatory regimes, etc. What can the educational sector do to push that and make that more attractive?
I know there are certain diplomas that are offered, especially at Seneca College, for nonprofit governance.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure about York. You can probably tell me better, but I think we have to offer it as a career alternative. And you're absolutely right, especially in the academic sector. It's not literally seen as a career path. I didn't even know that this was a career path until I was actually in the field.
Right.
And philanthropic foundations could be that better alternative for individuals who are like, I want to focus on social impact, but I also want to be able to pay my bills and have some food on the table. So the philanthropic foundation world is somewhere you should be pursuing. Oftentimes it's not talked about because it's just almost like that ingrained traditional knowledge that certain individuals in certain communities know, whereas others are like, okay, well, for me to get a stable job, which is no longer stable, I should go to the Ontario Public Service, I should go to government, which now the only way to get in is through a contract, and you don't get your benefits, etc. But that's what needs to, that's just a part of the solution. Like, we need to actually start mandating and having courses and diplomas about nonprofit governance, and then also retention strategies, and then make sure that we pay our people. And make sure that, foundations, when they're receiving applications like ours, this is one thing that we do, but other foundations, we sometimes need to advise them on doing this, but a lot of them are sort of hesitant to give to high overhead. They want to support the programs and the operating. The same way that individuals want to support the programs and operating budget, they don't want to support sort of the HR or the staff, the salaries or the rent. And that is so key in actually getting things done.
Now, you went to the charitable foundation from the nonprofit
Yes.
sector. Where do charitable foundations recruit from? Are you typical, or is it idiosyncratic?
Completely non-typical. I think so, and that's just reflective of the rooms that I'm in. I think that there's a lot of, again, sort of, it's what you know. It's who you know, not what you know. A lot of recruitment happens either through friend of a friend or referral. Could be a member of the family who has founded the foundation. Sometimes applications come in, but because there's not sort of a big push from academia to stream individuals into this line of work, it's kind of like, you have to know it. You have to know who to talk to, and you have to do a lot of networking. I only knew this because, again, being on the other side, I knew how the foundation was working, I knew how the nonprofit sector worked, and we start to build those relationships. But it isn't a common thing. Okay. Does anybody else have any other questions for me? Comments? Yes.
You know how you're talking about when you go to certain conferences in the States,
Yes.
they're much more direct about issues in the sector. And I find that on the research side too, like the sector in the States is much more critical of issues and say, hey, are you just perpetuating the status quo and so on.
Yeah.
When we're in Canada, we either avoid the critique or don't want to do it publicly, or we just kind of very polite about it or something.
Yeah. It's just the case. Like, that's been the case. The interesting thing about public policy and the way that kind of shakes up philanthropy a bit is that philanthropy, because it is an industry that is based on who you know, and because it's based on those relationships, in public policy, the interesting thing, especially when you're taking it from an advocate lens, there's an essence of opposition within the role. In public policy, especially when you're influencing or trying to change something, there's a winner and a loser, which means that oftentimes what you do is confrontational. So in some cases, if my advocacy is, if I'm advocating to a certain government and I'm not a fan of their policy because it's oppressing some of the grantees that we're dealing with, I have to take an oppositional stance with them. And that's, of course, not the nicest thing to do. But that's what really is responsible for change. And within the sector, if we were to start saying, we're the ones with the problem, we're the ones that need to start implementing the more diverse hiring strategies, we need to be giving a lot more money than we are. When you start to look effectively and internally, the automatic sort of human response is put your defenses up. So because people are not, I feel for the most part, willing to have that conversation, it's very difficult to get that change. Whereas in the States, because things are so desperate and dire, it's just like, forget everything, we're going to tell you how it is, and you don't care who you offend. So that's the difference in discourse, but it was just so night and day when I went there. It's just completely different. I just hope that we don't have to get to a point where it forces us into that situation.
Is it true that I saw this, that Americans give more to charity than Canadians do? In terms of per capita, if you were to look at per capita, that Americans are actually more a philanthropic society than what Canadians are.
Yes. Yes, that was part of the Imagine Canada report as well.
Right, which is something, as Canadians, we would think, no, that can't be true because we're
That's
nicer
right.
than Americans, right?
That's
But I
right.
remember seeing that stat one time, yes.
Yes,
So
it's
that-
the-
You also have to look at public expenditure
Yeah.
on the sorts of things the charitable donations are given to support.
Right,
Canadian governments of all levels do more than
Yes.
American governments. do.
which would
Yes.
make reasonable, and I guess
It
that's
offsets
why
levels.
you're concerned, which then segues into a great question, if the conservative government, by virtue of ideology, starts to pull away from certain sectors that an NDP government would be involved in, thereby hoping that a foundation or not-for-profit will go in, are they prepared to provide the necessary structural supportive aspects for that not-for-profit to do the work that the government was once doing?
That's the problem. Like, that's the big problem. We're seeing cuts, like almost immediate, unexpected, with no warning cuts, almost overnight.
Yeah,
And then when it comes to like, okay, who's gonna clean up the mess that's left in the void, there's no discussion from the government. That's what's become a real problem, specifically in Ontario.
right.
Because the way that it's being done. At least if there's some warning and if there's some sort of transition plan, there are foundations around the table, and the foundations have agreed to fund a certain sector, then happy to do it. But what we're seeing now is more emerging needs than ever before, because areas that were once supported fully by government are no longer supported. So while the Laidlaw Foundation is focused on youth, and the McLaughlin Foundation is focused on this, and the Maitri Foundation is focused on unemployment or poverty reduction, should we now be focusing on off-system spending? Like, we have to be thinking about these different things, because if we don't, then who will?
Right.
And because we have the money, the responsibility should be on us because of the privilege that we have.
Right.
So that's the problem, and it's creating a mass sort of, that's one of the biggest conversations right now in the sector.
I think it'd be interesting to have you back next year to see where we are provincially, because this government, I think, is going to be receding from a number of sectors that the Liberal government was taking care of.
Yeah.
And they're going to do it and expect foundations to jump in, but I don't think they're gonna provide that bridge
Right.
or that support for the foundation to pick up the slack, and it's gonna be a disaster.
Yeah, there's barely any right now, and we're hearing even from the child welfare space that they may be pulling funding, and that's one of our sort of top priority areas. So there's a lot of that that's happening right now, but it would be very interesting to see what's happening. Keeping an eye on it.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you all for having me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
In our appreciation, I'd like to give you what has become one of the most coveted items at York University.
Okay.
It cannot be bought.
Okay.
It can only be received in appreciation for giving a talk here at McLaughlin College.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.